Thank you all for joining us today. This is our first memo writing workshop that we're hosting, and I hope that you guys get a lot out of it. Memos are really important. It's a really good way of learning how to distill a really broad subject sometimes into a one-page document that anybody can read real easily, and it makes your point a lot more clear sometimes too. So I hope you guys gain a lot of knowledge, want to sign up for the competition. So the competition instructions are on this sheet here. I hope everybody grabbed it. And there's some memo ideas on the back of it as well, in case you guys aren't sure what you want to write a topic about. So there's just 8 of them here. It can be a lot more. We're just trying to keep things a little bit local. So if you can do local policies, local issues, that'd be fantastic. All right? Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, and our workshop host today is Scott Steele. He comes to us from the Saunders Building. What is your actual title?
Faculty member in Public Health Sciences and Director of Regulatory Science Programs in our Translational Science Institute.
Perfect. And he teaches a spring class about science and technology policy. It's really good. You learn a lot from it. So if you guys are interested and are able to take classes in the spring, definitely sign up for it.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Since we're a small group, I know a couple of you, but maybe could we do just a quick name and maybe what program you're in?
Sure. I'll start. Nazash, I'm in the biochemistry department.
I'm in the toxicology program.
I'm Madison. I'm in the prep perspective.
I'm Israel, and I'm in biochemistry program.
I'm Nick. I'm in microbiology and immunology.
I'm Janelle, also in microbiology. I'm Sydney, also in microbiology and immunology.
I'm Denise in the Translational Medical Science program.
Okay, biomedical engineering.
Raven in Translational Biomedical Science.
Rohit, biophysics.
Neuroscience.
Background neuroscience.
Brendan, neuroscience.
Neurosciences.
Thank you. Appreciate it. This is designed to be interactive, so I've kind of followed some guidance and providing a little bit of background, but most of the time I want to focus on handing out a couple examples of memos that take a few minutes to read and get, spend a little time critiquing so you have a sense of different types. But I thought I'd give a quick bit of background on, for those who, I know some of you are quite familiar, but for those who aren't, policy, science policy in general, different ways to think about that, tied into hopefully working on a memo for the competition. And again, we'll take a look at a couple of examples of science policy memos. Hopefully we'll be able to do both of those. One quite different, so I thought I'd give you a flavor of those. And one more of an advocacy memo, which we'll talk about, which is slightly different approach. And please ask any questions throughout this, just a bit of background. So I think we're all familiar with, just to set the stage, policy in general. So there's obviously policies at many different levels in organizations. One way to think about it is just an approach to have a consistent way to deal with an issue. And of course, at a university, we have many policies around transfer credits to financial aid to conflict of interest and codes of conduct. So, but of course, all different types of organizations have policies for dealing with various issues. A lot of what we'll talk about in science policy is really more around government and what kind of policies they develop for science, technology, health. And so it's more in the realm of public policy, which is really what a lot of what the government does. It focuses on public problems that are facing the public at large. So within thinking about the policy memos and recommendations you might have, and these are more federal, but there's a state advocacy memo that we'll take a look at. The kinds of recommendations or policy tools that you often, sorry, I'm moving around, hope that's not creating problems. I'm not used to being mic'd and videotaped. I'm usually anonymous. So the kinds of things you can think about and what you'll see in some of these memos as examples are different types of tax incentives or tax breaks that the government, whether federal, state level, might provide to encourage certain behavior, subsidies, regulation, so whether it's around medical products or environmental issues, tobacco. One of the memos is focused on tobacco. There's certain regulations that you might recommend in your memos. Education, obviously, is another. And these aren't you can take multiple approaches. Education, consumer education, may be one type of policy that the government will really focus on to address an issue, to change behavior. In our area in science, technology, and research and development programs, so whether it's creating new programs to focus on certain areas, whether it's focusing more on cancer or Alzheimer's disease or nanotechnology, whatever the issue is, expanding programs, more funding for certain programs are the types of recommendations and policy drivers that you might see in a memo that you might recommend. Any questions on those? So when we think about science policy and kind of the interface there, a couple different ways to think about this. And again, these are just from my perspective. One aspect of that is thinking about how policy is impacting science and research and development and health issues. So that could be, again, at a federal or state level, including funding decisions, setting priorities. So whether it's at a federal level, the White House or Congress sets direction to agencies and departments that these are areas that you should really prioritize in your funding, in your research, or for regulations. Obviously, they can set regulations too. Again, whether it's around certain research areas, even we're going to focus on increasing biomedical research over the next 10 years, or physical sciences. So certain research priorities, training and workforce. So if you want to have training grants focused on a particular area, or K through 12 STEM education. And so through different programs, policy initiatives, funding, obviously, those areas can be prioritized. Innovation. So will new programs and funding be focused on more disruptive research, innovative technologies, or will it be more focused on incremental programs? Ethics and regulatory compliance, so whether it's stem cell research or gene therapies, gene editing technologies, 3D printing, the digital health areas. So where are there areas that there's some concern? We see that in gene editing and cloning. So there could be policies focused on that, or moratoriums on certain research. So those are all different kinds of different approaches. And so that's policy that directly affects science and technology and research. And then there's, of course, this aspect of science informing policy. So having more science-based policy and recognizing that on big policy decisions, science is only one aspect of it. Of course, there's economic, ethical, social issues tied to that. But that's particularly those with scientific backgrounds being involved in the policy process, whether it's through analysis, proposing different recommendations, writing memos throughout all different areas of government, of advocacy groups, of non-government organizations. So, and then hopefully one piece that gets left off sometimes is then going back and evaluating the policy. So what were the impacts? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So to kind of feed back into the policy-making process, because sometimes the policy comes out, and then particularly if it's political, people move on, and so it's never really assessed again to see how effective it was. Question? And so a little bit of context too, and people can debate the different roles and definitions for this, but just to think about as you work on memos and think about science policy, I think it's helpful to think about the political piece versus the policy process, and obviously there's a lot of interface there, but I think of the politics generally being really focused on power and influence. Obviously, it impacts creation of policy, but it's more about who's currently in charge. So whether it's president or who controls Congress, or at a state level in the assembly and the governor, but it's more about that interplay and advocacy and who controls the direction. And of course, under that, there's also a policy making process, more around the development of policy and analysis and evaluation, and if you're doing policy work, where you sit in different parts of within the government or different organizations, that can be more or less political, and how your role and how policy is shaped. Obviously, if you're working directly in the White House or for a senator, you're more tied into the political aspects of it, where if you're at an agency, the NIH or National Science Foundation or Department of Energy and doing policy work or programmatic work, it's going to be less political. So does that make sense? And so again, as thinking about science policy careers too, as I was mentioning, where you sit in different organizations obviously will impact how political the policy process is and what your role and influence will be. And tied to that too, there's I think there's science policy, and we talked about that, how policy impacts science and how science can inform policy. And then there's also science advocacy, which a lot of organizations that just promote science broadly and not necessarily doing analysis of different options and outcomes, but really just focused on advancing and supporting scientific research. So complex areas, but just try to dissect it a little bit. So as you look at different organizations and where memos are coming from or recommendations are coming from, it's important to think about where do they sit and how political or non-political are they. Not making any judgment of that, it's good to know where the recommendations are coming from. And so when we think about particularly the policy memos and the one-page memos, there's an important piece, obviously it's reduced in one page, but to think about some policy analysis. So looking at potential recommendations or what are the outcomes, what the trade-offs will be in those different options, and then ultimately making a recommendation. And so, again, a piece that's important to think about too is evaluation. In a short policy memo, you won't be doing a lot of proposing a lot of evaluation, but an important consideration is in that background when you're thinking about your policy memo. Evaluate what policies are in place, what's been tried before. Is this a novel approach, or has it been done in the past but it failed, and why? So providing that kind of context and background is really, really important. And some of you will be familiar with this, but one different way to approach thinking about the different roles and the values that different policy analysts may have, and what you'll see reflected in memos is kind of a simplified version of this is from the Weimer textbook, thinking about an analyst being, again, simplified, but more of a objective tactician who's really focused on kind of the analysis, purist almost, to a client advocate who's, particularly if you're someone working with a senator or in the governor's office, you're really focused on supporting that individual and you're kind of connected to them. And then an issue advocate, whether it's, whether it's for cancer research or neurological disorder or nanotechnology, you're really focused on a particular issue that you're promoting or supporting. And so kind of the values and the areas you're focused on will vary based on that. And again, this is a more simplified version, but where someone who's really focused on the analytical piece, that's going to be their primary focus and less concerned with a particular client versus a client or issue advocate. So you'll see that reflected in memos and cases as you review them. Any questions on it? And of course, there's a range of different organizations and societies and associations that do policy analysis, advocacy. Again, kind of the Cancer Society and others being more obviously issue advocates, think tanks and national academies and other organizations that are, in many cases, really focused on providing objective analysis. So just to make sure we have time to review some memos. As was mentioned, I think one of the reasons we focus on the one-page policy memo is I think you get a lot of experience writing longer research papers and research analysis, but the one-page memo is a nice way to really condense those thoughts into clear, concise recommendations and can be used in a lot of different venues. So I think it's a useful skill to have. Certainly incorporates a lot of research and policy research, more basic research, and looking at some of the analysis that you'll bring into your recommendation, but really distills that down. And certainly an important piece, as we've talked about the different roles, is to think about who's your memo directed to. That's obviously critical in thinking about, as we talked about, where do they sit in the political spectrum? So are the politics going to be really critical to them, or is that less important? And thinking about what authority do they have? So making sure your recommendation is relevant for what they can actually carry out. If it's an issue that requires new legislation and really needs to go to Congress, so, providing it to NIH while they can influence legislation isn't going to be as helpful. So thinking about that. And a general format we often use, and this is whether it's a longer policy memo or the one-page format, is shown here. To have kind of start off with an executive summary that summarizes the issue and your recommendation. Like most executive summaries, you usually end up writing that at the end, but include some kind of background and problem statement, just clearly articulating what the issue is you're trying to address. Then go through some of the policy options. And again, for this kind of policy memo, you're going to lay out some different recommendations, and obviously you have little space, but to try to touch on what are the trade-offs, what are the likely outcomes with going with this option versus another option. Recognize where there's deficiencies and challenges, and then having a clear recommendation at the end. You don't want to leave it completely up in the air. You really want to make that recommendation. And again, considering your audience, who's the memo directed to. So make sure that's a recommendation that they can really implement. Any questions on any of that before we take a look at some examples? Okay. So I'll hand these out, and maybe we can. So there's two policy memos and then one advocacy memo I thought we could take a look at, and just to provide. And these two are quite different, just to provide a little context. And a couple of you have seen these before, so you should have really good feedback on these. This one is a little more historical. So this was a memo. The scenario was that you're a policy analyst in writing a memo to the new Secretary of Homeland Security. So this is 2002, 2003, after September 11th, 2011, terrorist attacks, anthrax attacks. So there's a new department. They've taken agencies from across the federal government, created new programs. There's a new secretary, and your recommendation, what you need to provide to them is recommendations around both short-term and long-term areas to focus on to address biological weapons. So in this one-page memo. So with that as background, maybe we can just take 5 minutes for you guys to look at it, and then just have an open discussion about what your thoughts are, what worked well, what didn't. Did everyone get to read through it? Okay. So maybe we can start with pros. What do you think is what works well about the memo points, the format?
This is a broad range of options. There's a lot of stuff that they say we can do. Yes.
Becomes a positive and negative, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
I think dividing it up into short-term and long-term goals is relatively useful, especially for something like this, where you can do immediate preparedness, and then long-term, like, okay, that's how we can handle it in order to have it not go, what can we do better in the future? So,
Right. Yes.
It was very concrete, and instead of saying things like improving academic surveillance,
it mentions what specific programs to expand and what specific agencies to give more funding to. So it like tells what it wants to do, and this is exactly how to do it.
Yeah, which is hard in one page, so it's, other thoughts? What do you think could be stronger or improved?
There aren't really alternatives or reasons why each thing should be done instead of any other things.
Right, prioritization, there's not a, yeah. And it does list a lot of options, but not, you kind of have to pick a couple.
Or it doesn't say which ones would give you the most. I mean, it's hard to quantify, but like they could say, you know, the increasing order of importance or decreasing order of importance, we should do this, this, and this.
Yes, yeah, given so many options.
I think part of the problem I have with it is it says all these things that we should do, like increase connectedness of this or increase funding for this or whatever, but it doesn't necessarily say why those are, like, what's problematic about that now, like, why can't we do this now, or like, why isn't this connected, or why is that a problem?
Right, so laying out what the real problem is and then the
If
recommendation.
it doesn't address what the current shortfalls are that call for new action, you know,
In the recommendations, it mentions that doing these things will also increase the ability to protect public health from naturally occurring threats, but the rest of it all focuses on bioterrorism. So it's kind of just throwing in that second idea almost in the last sentence versus using it throughout the document.
Right, that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, I think, so the kind of the request was focused on that bioterrorism, but they could have, yeah, integrated that throughout the
Yeah, like mentioning what
recommendation.
specific things would also help in case of naturally occurring epidemic versus just putting it in at the end, like was
Right.
the second thought.
Other thoughts? So I think we touched on everything I had. Yeah, I think a good list and pretty concise. It did call out specific programs, but as you guys mentioned, really it needs more of a prioritization. It's a lot of things. You can't really do all of them realistically. And put some specifics where you can, particularly around budget. I think in policy memos, it's nice to have, again, it's going to be an estimate. You can't be super precise, but you know, what's the scale of what this is going to cost, these different programs, and that really helps factor in what to prioritize. Other thoughts on that? Yes.
This is just a question for budget estimates. I guess it depends on where you are and what you're aiming for. But like, how would you go about generating? Like, is that something that you just refer to current data available, or do you spend?
Right, with some of these federal programs, at least, in most cases, you can go and look what's the current spending. You know, what's the funding of that the strategic national stockpile, or you know what's currently being spent, and you could say we need to double it, or we need to get really detailed. It can be hard sometimes, but you can usually find what the current budget is, so you can at least have some back of the envelope estimates to work with. But again, I think what's your justification for doubling it, or but there's usually something to work with at least. And then you can, in this case, you can even look at what does the agency have authority to move around versus what do they need to go to Congress and say to ask for more additional funding. Anything else on this one? Okay. So for a very different one, this is a much more focused requested memo. Is anyone familiar with the Cures Act? So this was legislation that I think it was 2016 when it was signed. But 21st Century Cures Act really focuses on speeding up biomedical innovation. So a lot of focus on NIH,
funding and policies, Food and Drug Administration, some things around health IT and health IT infrastructure. So massive act, but there was a particular part here around proposing this Innovative Cures Consortium to help particularly speed up, well, you'll see in the memo, but so the request was for that you're on the staff for the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which has been developing this proposed legislation. And the representative asked you specifically, looking at this part of the proposed legislation, do you provide a assessment of this, and do you support it or not? So much more targeted. So I'll give you a few minutes to look at this one. What do people think about positive points for this one? Very different question, different approach. Thoughts?
It's very clear, what they were arguing for, and it's amazing when you just say we don't want this, but it's a very clear prescription of their opinion.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's almost, we'll talk about, as I read this again, think about, it's almost similar more to the advocacy now, because it doesn't necessarily talk about the positives of what's being proposed. It's pretty clearly against. But other thoughts? Yes?
It's very to the point compared to the last one. It's like half the word count.
It's what?
It's like half the word count of the previous memos. So,
True. A very targeted question too, though, versus, yeah, the first one is hard in a one-page memo. Yeah, what should we do for biological weapons? Short and long term, but yeah, so very concise. Yes.
I like how they took down what was supposed to be the proposal for, I guess, like the new policy, and they listed specifically what departments were already doing that and which parts they were doing.
Yes, yeah, very clear overview of what's in place that looks similar. I mean, it's always a big issue to me, what already exists or what's been tried, and this probably isn't the first time someone's thought about this.
Yeah, I thought they did a nice job of that. I thought they could have talked about, just arranged it in, I guess, with the background, say like, these are the things that the consortium, the law says the consortium will do, and then a sub-bullet for each of those, how that is already done. So that you, instead of just saying these are the things that are already done.
Right, I thought in the background they didn't lay out too much about what's the consortium really about and how it's structured. Right? Kind of a general sense of what its goal is, but how is it organized? Again, I don't think they put anything about the budget in here too, so that's less of a budget impact here, but still just good to have a sense of that. Yes?
I was gonna say that, like, for me, it was too vague, like, nothing is specific. Like, they talk about all the 21st century cures, but they're not specific. They're talking about, like, chronic diseases, infectious diseases, or what population they're targeting. I feel the same with the policy option when they're mentioned by policy aims and the roles of each department. Like, I don't think they were specific on what type of role each department can actually, like, deliver or what are the specific recommendations they're giving. Like, I feel it's too vague.
How this other programs are directly related or already address that specifically. Yeah. Because they have a little extra space, they could provide a little more detail. Did you have a? Yeah.
I have 2 points. So one, I just sort of liked how they did stuff like just underlining or italicizing just to emphasize certain points. I thought that was good. I just had a sort of question, I guess I wonder where this memo comes from, because there were more spelling mistakes and grammar mistakes that I noticed throughout it. I don't know if that would be looked upon negatively if you were saying this was to be well, maybe they're not very serious about this.
Yes, the pros and cons of formatting are very, very important. So yeah, using the bullets, the underline, the spacing is all really helpful. And yeah, but spelling errors, especially if you have something at the very beginning, may not get very far through the rest of the memo. For a policymaker, yeah. Other points? Yes.
different programs, but how are you going to propose to consolidate these programs together? That almost sounds like it's a counter. Like the whole point of the consortium, what maybe would be to consolidate these things. So you're kind of arguing two things here.
Right, that as an alternative, maybe some of these existing programs should be integrated, but how? Yeah. That's a good point. Yes.
I don't know, just the memo, like on an emotional level, I felt like it kind of like spoke to me in the sense that it's people trying to come up with like, you know, these lawmakers coming in and saying, you know, we got to do this, we're not doing this well enough. Like, it's like, are you kidding me? So I don't know, I felt like that, you know, I felt myself very much agreeing with most of it just because it seemed like it hit the nail on the head, and then, you know, people are coming in with, we're going to build a new agency to collaborate. And it's like,
this has never been done before. But if you can channel their energy into something productive, that's always helpful too, other than, yeah, just, no, this isn't a good idea.
Right. I mean, I guess there's a frustration with not having like cures and not having a lot of advances, but I feel like, you know, they go a lot about like, well, people don't realize how hard it is to actually do that, like scientifically, so they don't really, maybe they don't quite get where the roadblocks are in the research. It's like, probably not a big translational roadblock. It's probably just that we don't have the science yet.
Right, and this could put in context other things in the Cures Act that are more helpful as far as funding and, you know, new regulatory paths for innovative drugs and devices. So. I think we touched on everything I had. There's actually even there's a foundation for NIH and a Reagan-Udall Foundation for FDA that also has some similar goals, so there could be even more support for this, this argument. But all right, our last, and I should give a little more background. So this, another type of memo or letter that you'll see, and it is a little different. I tend to do more of the policy analysis memos, but advocacy memos come from organizations. Our university, the one I'll show you is where the university is part of an association that provides these. They're usually targeted, takes a very clear position on a particular issue, often proposed legislation or proposed regulation or funding decision. And again, not always one page, this one's a little over a page, but often is not doing an analysis, isn't looking at different types of recommendations and kind of assessing trade-offs, but it's kind of a very much clear position paper, either in support or opposition. They might touch on another, kind of discredit the other perspective, but it's usually just promoting their position. Some of the same kind of approaches apply, though, as far as being clear and concise. And this one, just a bit of context. So it's a proposed bill or amendment, really, to regarding research tobacco. So you may know, if any of you work in this area, so obviously for tobacco products, there's regulation regarding having certification, there's stamping, there's taxes involved for sale and production, but there's been exemptions for research tobacco. So there's faculty here who use research tobacco products in their NIH and other, including state-funded research, and those are exempt. And I think they reference one. I think there's one or only a handful of manufacturers of these research tobacco products that are used for research studies. And so historically they've been exempt from having to go through this process of being registered and have the taxes and the certification. But there's been a more recent reinterpretation of that, and so the state has taken a position to require this facility to go through that process, just like they were selling tobacco for non-research purposes. So this is a memo supporting the proposed legislation to clarify that that should be exempt. So that's a little bit of background. What do people think? You can see a very different style in this advocacy memo. And this, I didn't mention, but this comes from an association of universities, so versus an individual. Any thoughts?
I like that it provides examples of somewhere where it's already been implemented, so it talks about the Kentucky Research Board now. It's going to be a similar model. We're going to do Steele.
We talk about the impact.
I like how at the end, they talked about like the potential tax benefit would be great, whereas the financial savings would be a more substantial thing to focus on.
Yeah.
I guess, for New York State consider this.
Right, the public health impact, the research impact, yes.
I liked how, from an advocacy standpoint, it really touched on things that are going to be catered to like the audience of the governor and any senators who read this, of jobs in New York State, federal funding, as well as New York State, of course, has a number of smoking cessation programs that kind of plays into that, if this will help those programs. So they really kind of cater to their audience.
Right, I think job numbers would have been
Yeah.
one thing, because that's anything state related, it's
Yeah.
how many jobs is this going to impact. Any other comments? Yes.
Could have had an outline format, or like a,
What's that?
more, I think could have had more of an outline type
Right.
to clearly delineate their reasoning. The other thing I didn't get out of it was, why did the department decide to change the regulation in the first place?
Their interpretation of,
Yeah, like
Yeah.
why did that happen? Because it's hard to say, like, it's hard to argue against it if you don't say why it happened.
yeah, is it just who's in charge now?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's actually, it's a different issue with the flavoring ban with e-cigarettes, it's also impacting research. But this is kind of a reinterpretation where it was already exempt, so. Yeah, even though it's an advocacy memo, I think there's some positives to having some kind of format to, as you lay it out. So you can see different approach with the advocacy versus more the policy analysis on one, but both used by different groups and organizations. You guys might have a preference, but I think for the competition, you're either.
Either or.
Yep.
Yeah.
Other comments, thoughts? Happy to explore anything.
Question, just for the competition, is there, I know it's one page, is there a font and font size?
Are you gonna?
I'm going to say no. I mean, I know when I was taking the class, I kind of minimized the margins sometimes in order to fit what I wanted to fit. So I think that'll be okay for us too. And we just make it readable.
Right.
If you can't read it yourself,
Not 8 point.
nobody else is going to be able to. So, yeah. For that, let's thank our workshop hosts. And then I just have a few comments that I want to add on about the competition. If you are interested in signing up and participating in it, can you just put a star next to your name up and sign-in sheet. And in addition, the directions, instructions for it are on this page here. The deadlines are on here as well for entering the memo, giving us a topic and when this memo would have to be submitted by. And remember, you have a chance to win $200. So it's really easy. It's just a 5-minute presentation in front of probably not that many people. Scott is going to be one of our judges. We have Alex Udelson coming in. He's the chief of staff for the mayor of the city, also coming in to evaluate the memos, and then Tracy Bass as well. So these 3 judges, and then we'll provide rubrics as well for what your presentation should include, and so that way you can have bullet points to check off, so better chances of winning. So I hope a lot of you enter. It's really easy, it's just 5 minutes. It's going to be in the Ryan Case Method Room. It's not that big either. And if you guys have questions, please feel free to email us or just ask anytime. Okay, thank you.